Look around. You can find cars like these on AutoTrader, like that car riding your tail. Or if you're tailgating right now, all those cars doubling as kitchens and living rooms are on AutoTrader too. Are you working out and listening to this ad at the same time? Well, multitasking pro, cars like the ones in the gym parking lot are for sale on AutoTrader. New cars, used cars, electric cars, maybe even flying cars. Okay, no flying cars, but as soon as they get invented, they'll be on AutoTrader. Just you wait. AutoTrader.
The Canadian response to threats of a trade war by Donald Trump and the carve-out he gave to Canadian energy has put Alberta's oil patch in the spotlight. Our oil, largely coming from Alberta, was given a smaller hit under Trump's tariff plan, and while any escalation has been pushed back a month, the threat to the oil patch is top of minds for many in the province. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. Calgary Herald business columnist Chris Varcoe joins me to discuss why Canadian energy was looked at differently under the proposed tariffs, what a trade war could mean to Alberta's economy, and how other key Alberta industries would fare if Trump moves ahead with his plans. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Chris, Canada thankfully avoided U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs plan for now. But I want to talk a little bit about the view from here in Alberta, as I know Alberta's kind of had an outsized part in the discussion in this country over the last several weeks, and there's been a lot of discussion about Canadian energy. Even when first announcing the tariffs, Trump said there would be a lower rate on oil and gas at 10% compared to 25% for other goods. And I'm curious, from your perspective, why do you suppose a lower rate was announced? Does that speak to the significance of Canadian oil and gas in our trade relationship with the United States?
Yes, I think it's an acknowledgement that it is the largest export that Canada sells to the United States, but more importantly, that disrupting the flow of that would cause pain for consumers in the United States as well as Canada. So Canada ships about 4 million barrels a day of oil south into the United States. We supply more than 60% of their foreign imports, and we are the dominant supplier of heavy oil to the U.S. Midwest refineries. So there's about 25 refineries in that area, including cities like Chicago. They get about 1.8 million barrels a day of Canadian crude. There's also a number of refineries in the Gulf Coast. They get about 1.4 million barrels a day. But particularly in the Midwest, interrupting or putting tariffs on Canadian oil would likely lead to higher energy prices for consumers at the pumps. There's also been a lot of pressure being put, or a lot of voices being, heard in the United States from groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Petroleum Institute lobbying the government in the White House, particularly to say, look, this is a bad idea. The energy systems here are integrated, and they've been highly integrated for decades, and interrupting that is going to cause pain for everybody throughout the system.
So, even though things are on hold, we're still not quite sure what may happen in a few weeks. I know that I believe March 5th was now the tariff deadline. Looking ahead to that date, and so suppose the President Trump decides that he's going to go ahead with these tariffs. What would the hit to the Alberta economy be should there be a 10% tariff on Canadian petroleum? What would that mean for the provincial government as well, which, as we know, is so reliant on oil and gas revenues?
Well, when we talk about the hit to the government, I guess you have to understand how they get hit. And one of the issues is if there's a tariff that's being placed on Canadian oil, it'll probably, the hit will be faced by consumers in the United States and refiners, but it'll also be faced by producers. And the question is, I guess, how that gets divvied up between those three groups. But the tariff itself would amount to about $6 US a barrel on Canadian oil. If you see that flow through to the producers, it's going to mean that they're going to see less money in their pockets. But it's also going to depress the price, or at least it will depress the price on Western Canadian Select heavy oil. That's how they sort of feel the pain. It also means less royalties for the government of Alberta. Every $1 change in that differential between benchmark U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude and Western Canadian heavy oil, or Canadian Select, is about $600 million. So a $6 a barrel hit is potentially about $3.6 billion a year in lower revenues for the Alberta government over the course of the year, if that exists. But again, we don't really know how that pain is going to be spread out between the refiners, the consumers, and the producers. And that's sort of the unknown right now.
Could tariffs mean an eventual slowdown in oil production? I know that Donald Trump has talked about Venezuela, and Venezuela produces a version of heavy oil, and maybe the refineries in the States could look to Venezuelan oil as opposed to Canadian oil. Like, what do the tariffs mean in terms of oil production here?
I think in the short term, it doesn't really mean that much, particularly at a 10% rate, which is, lower than the 25% rate. So it's a level that will cause some pain, but it's not, I think, going to be catastrophic in the short term. And I don't think it impacts production that much in the short term. However, duration is important. And then the question is, will that rate go up above 10%? I think what you will see is producers will begin to re-examine their capital spending plans for the year. They're already in the middle of the winter drilling season, so that's probably not going to get changed. But they could change their plans and their spending later in the year, and that could potentially impact production, or more likely production increases that were already planned.
And what avenues does Alberta have to try and do an end run around all this? Could we look to try and get more oil by rail out to the West Coast and maybe look to other overseas markets? Could we limit production here until such a time that tariffs aren't an issue? What effect would that have, and what powers does the Alberta government have?
Yeah, there's a number of tools in the toolkit, so to speak, that they could look at and that the industry could look at as well. One of them is the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. So TMX right now is moving about 700 or 720,000 barrels a day. It has the capacity to move about 890,000 barrels a day. So there's potentially an additional 180,000 barrels a day that could go through to the West Coast, get put onto tankers, and then go to any market in the world. That's always been sort of the argument in favor of Trans Mountain. Some oil could also, from Western Canada, could go all the way through the United States and get re-exported through the U.S. Gulf Coast. So there's the capacity to move additional barrels that way. However, that probably wouldn't shelter all of the oil, and certainly I think you would see some discount on Canadian crude. So the Alberta government could also try and curtail its production, or basically put in place mandatory production quotas. Now, this might seem pretty extreme, and it is, but they have done this in the past when we saw the price differential really blow out for Western Canadian Select. So back in 2018 and 2019, there was limited pipeline capacity, and that differential, which trades in around that $12 to say $15 or $18 a barrel range, actually blew out to more than $40 a barrel. And so the Alberta government, at that time Rachel Notley's government, instituted the curtailment policy, where they gave out sort of mandatory production quotas, and that almost instantly lifted the price up. Now, bear in mind, it means less volume going out, so that means they get less volume and less money from that. It also leads to less revenue, but it supports the price from going up. So there has been some discussion on whether the Alberta government would look at dual curtailment again. And this isn't just this isn't just an NDP policy, I might add. In 2019, Jason Kenney's UCP government also continued with the curtailment policy till it was wound down in 2020. And at that time, Daniel Smith did support curtailment. So it's not like this would be completely off the table, but I suspect at this stage of the game, they're really looking for a negotiated settlement.
We'll be right back. Now, obviously, when Canadians think about Alberta and big industry, they think oil and gas, but as we know, oil and gas isn't Alberta's only big industry. What other sectors in Alberta are bracing for a big hit in the coming weeks?
Well, I think at least externally, when we look at sort of big industries that sell a lot of products in the United States, you got to think about agriculture. There's more than $8 billion of food and ag goods that were exported in the United States from Alberta back in 2023. The beef industry, for example, was more than $3 billion. Petrochemicals is another large industry in this province, and that's about $5 billion. Chemicals itself are about $5 billion in exports that year. You've got manufacturing and machinery. That was about $5 billion as well in exports. And then, of course, you've got all the industries here that will be impacted by any sort of price increases that they're going to face, particularly if there's counter tariffs in place. So this isn't just about oil and gas. There's a number of other industries and obviously consumers that are going to be impacted by this.
And what effect could the tariffs have on the beef industry? Obviously, it's more down market, as it could increase the price of food in the United States. But could it mean that Canadian feedlots could suffer, as perhaps American beef producers would want to keep cattle down in the United States? What's the calculus there?
Yeah, I was talking to a large feedlot operator just the other day in southern Alberta, and they said that they would be devastated by a 25% tariff on their products. They estimate that the price right now for cattle, that the tariff would represent about $1,100. So it's a big hit for them. And he said, we're dealing with really thin margins here of between 1% and 5%. And there's some items are just completely non-discretionary, and that would include the price for feed and also for staffing. So they don't have a lot of wiggle room, and they would really be punished by a 25% tariff on their product.
Are there any measures that these industries are taking to potentially soften the blow or to prepare for the hammer coming down on March 5th? Is there anything they can really do, or just kind of watch helplessly and hope that a deal gets reached?
I think it's kind of all of the above. If I go back to that feedlot operator we just talked about, he's saying that he's really been cautious and slowing down on his purchase of live cattle until he has a better read on what the situation is going to hold for. I've talked to manufacturers who are saying that they're looking at, or they have been accelerating shipments to the border over the last few weeks to try and beat any potential tariffs. And some companies, and particularly manufacturers, are frankly looking at, do we set up shops? Do we set up assembly or sub-assembly shops in other states to try and figure out a way around the tariff? And then you've got things like supply chains that need to be, supported and be resilient. So I think there's sort of an array of different solutions that people are looking at right now, but I don't think there's any sort of one silver bullet here.
Yeah. Are they worried about not just a loss of business, but the impact on jobs? Is anyone kind of forecasting what this could all mean for people who work in Alberta, whose companies deal with the U.S. market?
I think if this lasts for a protracted period of time, there is absolutely going to be concern about jobs. A study that was done by ATB Financial, which is a crown corporation of the Alberta government, but also does a lot of analysis, came out yesterday and said that if we saw a full-scale tariff battle of, the 25% on all products other than oil and gas, which would be tariffed at 10%, and counter tariffs put in place, you'd basically be pushing Alberta close to, but not quite into a recession, down to about 0.5% GDP growth this year. And it would mean about 35,000 fewer jobs than its base case scenario without tariffs being put in place. So you can see it would definitely hit the employment, and it would also hit the unemployment levels as well.
Lastly, and this may be a little bit of forecasting or crystal ball reading here. Donald Trump has talked a lot about trade between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, and how the U.S. is getting a bad deal. But this is also the same president who declared victory during his first presidency in getting the Canadian, U.S., Mexico trade agreement signed. Could all of this be a precursor to reopening that trade agreement, or trying to find new ways of dealing with trade between the countries? And perhaps it's not a North America-wide agreement, but separate agreements between the U.S. and Mexico and the U.S. and Canada. How could that all play out?
Well, again, it's really difficult to know what the motivation here is for President Trump. But I think what is undeniable is the fact that the CUSMA agreement is mandatory. It comes up for a mandatory renegotiation in 2026. And we've heard some talk, and even some premiers suggest that that's going to need to be accelerated, that we need to basically reopen that agreement now and try and find a fix. So that definitely could be one of the issues that I think is at play here, and that you're going to hear a lot more discussion about in the coming weeks and months.
Well, yeah, I know it's a story that we'll be covering very closely over, as you say, the coming weeks and months as we approach that March 5th deadline, and then perhaps whatever comes afterward. Chris, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Chris Varcoe. More from him at calgaryherald.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.